Sometimes the monsters we fear most are simply broken souls who forgot they were once loved. Every teacher knows the pain of watching a bright student disappear into darkness, wondering if they could have done something different. For decades, Alaric the Alpha Vampire has terrorized the kingdom of Vaelthorne. His crimson eyes strike fear into the bravest warriors. Armies flee at the mention of his name. Kings hide behind castle walls when he draws near. But when a mountain blizzard traps him with desperate refugees, fate brings an unexpected reunion. Elric, a poor teacher, recognizes something familiar in those deadly eyes. This monster was once his student, a gentle boy, he thought, lost forever. Can an old teacher's love reach through centuries of pain and awaken the humanity buried beneath the beast? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain paths of Vaelthorne had always been treacherous, but in the depths of winter they became something far worse, a graveyard for the unprepared. Elric pulled his threadbare cloak tighter against the biting wind as he guided his small band of refugees along the narrow ledge that wound between towering peaks. Snow fell in thick, wet flakes that clung to everything, turning the world into a blur of white and grey. Behind him, 17 souls followed in weary silence. Men, women, and children who had lost everything to the endless war that plagued their kingdom. Some carried bundles of possessions, others bore only the clothes on their backs. All shared the same hollow look of people who had seen too much suffering. Master Elric, called Martha, a baker's wife whose hands were cracked from years of kneading dough. How much farther to the pass? Elric turned, his weathered face creased with concern as he studied the darkening sky. At 53, he had learned to read the mountain's moods, and what he saw now made his stomach tighten with worry. Another day's journey, perhaps two, if the weather holds. He tried to keep the doubt from his voice, but Martha's sharp eyes caught it anyway. "And if it doesn't hold?" she asked, hefting the small bundle that contained everything she owned. Before Elric could answer, young Mira, barely 6 years old and clutching a carved wooden horse, stumbled in the snow. Her mother, Sarah, caught her with practiced ease, but the child's face was pale with exhaustion. "We'll make it," Elric said with more confidence than he felt. "We've come too far to turn back now." The group had been traveling for 3 weeks, fleeing the latest siege that had torn through their village of Millbrook. The war between King Aldrich and the rebel lords had consumed the kingdom for nearly a decade, leaving ordinary people caught between armies that cared nothing for their survival. Villages burned, crops withered, unharvested, and families scattered like leaves in the wind. Elric had gathered these particular refugees not by chance, but by design. Each bore the mark of persecution that went beyond mere displacement by war. Martha had been accused of witchcraft for her knowledge of healing herbs. Thomas, the blacksmith, had been branded a traitor for refusing to forge weapons for soldiers who murdered civilians. Young Sarah carried Mira in her arms because the child's father had been executed for speaking against the king's brutal taxes. They were outcasts among outcasts, people whose only crime had been possessing conscience in a world that rewarded cruelty. As they walked, Elric's mind drifted back to the reason for his own exile. The carved wooden chess set in his pack, a gift from a former student, reminded him of quieter days when his greatest worry had been whether young minds would grasp the complexities of ancient history and forbidden philosophy. The Academy of Vaelthorne had been his life for 27 years. Stone halls filled with eager students, libraries stacked with precious texts, debates that lasted deep into the night. He had taught the children of nobles and merchants, guiding them through the wisdom of ages past and encouraging them to think beyond the narrow confines of their station. But wisdom, he had learned, could be dangerous. The texts he taught ancient philosophies that spoke of justice, equality, and the inherent worth of all souls had been deemed seditious by King Aldrich's court. When several of his former students began speaking out against the crown's excesses, the blame fell squarely on their teacher. The exile had been swift and merciless. One day he stood before a classroom full of bright faces. The next he was branded a corrupter of youth and cast out with nothing but the clothes on his back and a small collection of books he had managed to hide. Among those bright faces had been one that still haunted his dreams, a gentle boy with curious dark eyes and an insatiable hunger for knowledge. Alaric Thorne, son of a minor lord, whose questions had challenged even Elric's vast learning. Where other students memorized and recited, Alaric questioned and explored. He would linger after lessons, eagerly discussing philosophy and ethics with a maturity that belied his 14 years. The boy had possessed a rare combination of brilliant intellect and genuine compassion qualities that Elric had believed would make him a force for good in the world. That had been 38 years ago. Elric had heard nothing of young Alaric's fate until 5 years after his exile, when whispered rumors reached him of a noble family massacred by bandits, their estate burned to the ground. The boy's name had been among the dead, another casualty of the kingdom's endless violence. The memory still brought tears to Elric's eyes. In all his years of teaching, no student had shown such promise, such pure potential for greatness. To know that such a bright light had been snuffed out by senseless brutality made the teacher's heart ache with regret and loss. A sudden gust of wind brought Elric back to the present. The snow was falling harder now, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. He called a halt and gathered the group in the shelter of a rocky outcropping. "We need to find shelter," he announced, studying the threatening sky. "There's an old way station about a mile ahead, a stone structure built for travelers in the old days. If we push hard, we can reach it before the worst of the storm hits." The refugees nodded wearily. They had learned to trust Elric's judgment over the weeks of travel. His knowledge of the mountain paths and weather patterns had kept them alive when others might have perished. As they prepared to resume their journey, old Henrik, a farmer whose fields had been salted by passing armies, pointed toward a dark shape moving along a parallel ridge. "What's that?" he asked, squinting through the falling snow. Elric followed his gaze and felt his blood chill. Even at this distance, there was something unnatural about the figure's movement, too fluid, too swift for any normal traveler. It seemed to glide rather than walk, leaving no visible tracks in the snow. "Probably another refugee," Elric said carefully, though his instincts screamed otherwise. "The mountains are full of displaced people these days." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were false comfort. In his years of exile, living on the margins of society, Elric had heard too many stories from desperate travelers. Tales of supernatural horrors that stalked the kingdom's dark places, creatures that fed on blood and fear. Most dismissed such stories as superstition, the fevered imaginings of traumatized minds. But Elric had lived long enough to know that legends often held kernels of truth. The ancient texts he had studied spoke of darker ages, when things beyond human understanding walked openly among mortals. The figure on the ridge had vanished, swallowed by the swirling snow. Elric tried to convince himself it had been nothing more than a trick of light and shadow, but the feeling of being watched lingered like ice in his veins. "Come," he said, shouldering his pack. "The storm won't wait for us." They pressed on through the deepening snow, each step becoming harder than the last. The wind howled between the peaks with a voice like tortured souls, and the temperature continued to plummet. Little Mira whimpered softly in her mother's arms, while the adults struggled to keep their footing on the increasingly treacherous path. When the way station finally appeared through the storm, it looked like salvation itself, a squat stone building with thick walls and a slate roof that had weathered decades of mountain winters. Built in more prosperous times for traders and pilgrims, it had been abandoned for years, but remained structurally sound. Elric fumbled with the heavy wooden door, his fingers numb with cold. The iron latch was stiff with rust and ice, but finally gave way with a protesting groan. The refugees stumbled inside, gasping with relief as they escaped the bite of the wind. The interior was sparse but dry, with a stone fireplace and rough wooden benches along the walls. Shuttered windows kept out the worst of the cold, and the thick walls muffled the storm's howl to a distant whisper. "Thomas, see if you can get a fire going," Elric instructed. "Martha, help me check the supplies. We may be here longer than planned." As the group settled in and began the process of making the space habitable, Elric found himself drawn repeatedly to the shuttered windows. Something about the figure on the ridge had unsettled him deeply, though he couldn't say exactly why. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, piling snow against the windows and doors. They were trapped now, until it passed, dependent entirely on their meager supplies and whatever Providence might provide. None of them could have imagined that Providence was about to take a form more terrifying and more miraculous than any of their desperate prayers had dared to request. The fire had been burning for barely an hour when the door exploded inward. Snow and wind rushed into the way station like a living thing, extinguishing half the flames and sending the refugees scrambling for whatever shelter they could find. Through the swirling chaos stepped a figure that seemed to absorb the meager light tall, draped in a black cloak that moved without regard for the natural laws of wind and gravity. Thomas reached for the iron poker beside the fireplace, his blacksmith's instincts screaming danger. Martha pulled little Mira behind her, while Sarah clutched her wooden horse so tightly her knuckles went white. The other refugees pressed themselves against the far wall, terror written across every face. The stranger straightened slowly, water and melting snow, cascading from his cloak to pool on the stone floor. When he pushed back his hood, gasps echoed through the chamber. His face was aristocratic, pale as fresh snow, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw that spoke of noble breeding. Dark hair fell in waves to his shoulders, framing features that would have been handsome if not for the eyes crimson as fresh blood, burning with an inner fire that no mortal gaze should possess. "Forgive the dramatic entrance," the stranger said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of the upper nobility. "The storm made subtlety impossible." Elric stepped forward, positioning himself between the newcomer and his charges. Years of protecting vulnerable students had honed his protective instincts, and every fiber of his being screamed that this was no ordinary traveler. "You're welcome to share our fire," Elric said carefully, "though I fear our provisions are limited." The stranger's lips curved in what might have been amusement. How gracious of Entessa! Those terrible eyes swept the huddled refugees, lingering on each face with predatory assessment. "Though I suspect your provisions would be of little interest to me." Henrik, the old farmer, made a strangled sound. "Sweet, merciful gods," he whispered. "The eyes." "What about my eyes?" the stranger asked, his tone deceptively mild. "They're red," Martha breathed, clutching her herb pouch like a talisman. "Red as blood." "Ah," the stranger smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white. "How observant." The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Several refugees began muttering prayers under their breath, while Thomas raised his poker with trembling hands. "You're him," Thomas said, his voice cracking. "The Alpha Vampire, the Bloodless." "Such dramatic names," the stranger mused, "though I suppose accuracy matters little when it comes to legends." He turned those burning eyes directly on Elric. "What do you think, teacher? Do I match the stories?" Elric's heart nearly stopped. The voice, beneath the cold amusement, carried an echo of something achingly familiar. A memory of eager questions and bright laughter, of a boy who saw wonder in every lesson. "Alaric," Elric whispered. The vampire froze. For a moment the mask of predatory calm slipped, revealing something raw and startled underneath. "What did you say?" "Alaric Thorne," Elric said more clearly, stepping closer despite the obvious danger. "Son of Lord Marcus Thorne. You had a sister named Lyanna, who loved to paint watercolors." Your favorite subject was ancient philosophy, and you could recite entire passages from the Chronicle of Kings. The vampire's composure shattered completely. In an instant, he moved not the natural movement of a man, but the supernatural speed of something beyond mortality. One moment he stood by the door. The next, his hand was around Elric's throat, lifting the older man from the ground. "Don't," he snarled, fangs fully extended. "Speak that name!" The refugees screamed. Thomas lunged forward with his poker, but the vampire's free hand caught the iron bar without even looking, crushing it to twisted metal. "Please," Sarah sobbed, holding Mira tight. "Please don't hurt him." "Hurt him?" The vampire laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "He has no idea what hurt means." But his grip on Elric's throat loosened fractionally. "You were my student," Elric gasped. "My brightest student. I thought you were dead." "I am dead." The vampire's voice rose to a roar that shook dust from the rafters. "That boy, you remember? He died 38 years ago, burned alive with everything he loved. What stands before you is something else entirely." "No," Elric said softly. "No, I don't believe that." The vampire's eyes widened in something that might have been pain. You should run screaming into the storm and pray I don't follow." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Do you know what I've done? Do you know how many lives I've taken?" "I know you're in pain," Elric said gently. "I know you're lost. I know the boy I taught would never hurt innocents without cause." For a heartbeat, the vampire's grip went completely slack. Elric's feet touched the ground again, and something almost human flickered in those terrible red eyes. Then, the moment shattered. The vampire released Elric completely and turned away, his shoulders rigid with barely contained fury. "That boy was weak," he said harshly. "He believed in justice, in mercy, in the goodness of others. Look where it got him." "Where did it get him?" Elric asked quietly. The vampire was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was hollow with old grief. "They came at night. Bandits," they said, though they wore no masks and left no demands. Systematic, professional. They killed the servants first, then my parents. They saved Lyanna and me for last." Several refugees gasped. Even little Mira seemed to understand that. Something terrible was being revealed. "They made me watch," the vampire continued, his voice devoid of emotion, "while they tortured her. While they—" He stopped, his hands clenching into fists. "She begged for me to save her, the great scholar, the brilliant student, and I could do nothing." Elric felt tears running down his cheeks. "Alaric, when she finally died," the vampire said, "I prayed for vengeance. I called upon any power that would listen, offered anything, my soul, my humanity, my eternal service, and something answered." He turned back to face Elric, and in his eyes was a pain so vast it seemed to swallow light itself. "I became what I am to avenge her, and when I was done with her killers, I found I could not stop. The hunger, the rage, they consumed everything I had been." "But you're here now," Elric said. "You chose to take shelter with us instead of feeding?" The vampire's smile was bitter. "Don't mistake circumstance for choice. The storm drove me here, nothing more. And when it passes," he didn't finish the threat, but it hung in the air like a blade. Young Mira, who had been silent throughout the exchange, suddenly pulled free from her mother's grip. Before anyone could stop her, she toddled forward and held up her wooden horse. "Pretty man, sad," she said solemnly. The vampire stared down at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment everyone in the room held their breath. Then, slowly, impossibly, he knelt to her level. "Yes," he said softly. "The pretty man is very sad." Mira nodded gravely and pressed the wooden horse into his pale hand. "Make better?" The vampire's fingers closed around the simple toy, and his entire body began to shake. When he looked up at Elric, his eyes held a desperate question. "Master Elric," he said, using the formal address of his student days, Is redemption possible for something like me? Before Elric could answer, the wind outside suddenly intensified to a howling fury. Snow began forcing its way through the gaps around the door and windows, and the temperature plummeted. "The storm's getting worse," Thomas observed needlessly. The vampire stood, still holding Mira's toy horse. "Much worse. This will last for days, not hours." He looked around the group of terrified refugees. "Our supplies." "Limited," Elric admitted. "Perhaps 3 days' worth if we're careful." "And after that?" "I don't know." The vampire nodded slowly. "Then, it seems we have a mutual problem. You need protection from the storm and predators that hunt these mountains. I need—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "I need to remember what it means to be human." He pulled something from beneath his cloak, a silver pendant on a broken chain. Even tarnished and dented, it was clearly expensive, delicately crafted. "This was Lyanna's," he said quietly. "The only thing of my old life I kept." He looked directly at Elric. "Help me understand why I still carry it, Master. Help me remember who Alaric Thorne was before the darkness took him." Outside, the storm raged with supernatural fury, trapping predator and prey together in a space barely large enough for 17 souls and the ghost of a long-lost student. The real battle for Alaric's humanity was about to begin. The first night passed without bloodshed, though none of the refugees truly slept. Elric sat vigil beside the dying fire, watching Alaric pace the perimeter of the way station like a caged wolf. The vampire had not spoken since his plea for understanding, and the silence stretched between them like a bridge neither dared cross. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it had intensified, driving snow through every crack and crevice until the interior walls sparkled with frost. The refugees huddled together for warmth, taking turns feeding precious bits of wood to the fire. "Master Elric," Martha whispered, pulling him aside as dawn's grey light filtered through. "The shutters. The food won't last. Even with careful rationing, we have perhaps 2 days." Elric nodded grimly. He had made the same calculation, watching their meager supplies dwindle with each meal. 17 mouths to feed, plus he glanced at Alaric, whatever sustenance a vampire might require. "There are herbs in these mountains," Martha continued, "but not in this weather. And with him here," she didn't need to finish. "He won't hurt you," Elric said, though he wasn't entirely certain of it himself. "Not while I'm here." "You sound very confident for a man who was nearly strangled last night." Thomas approached, his blacksmith's hands wrapped around a cup of precious hot water. "We need to talk about practical matters," he said bluntly. "Food, warmth, defense. That thing may claim to remember his humanity, but I've seen what vampires do to villages. What they leave behind. His name is Alaric," Elric corrected gently, "and he was a good boy once. Boys grow up to become monsters," Thomas replied. "The evidence is standing right there." As if summoned by their conversation, Alaric appeared beside them with that unnatural vampire silence. The refugees tensed, but he raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "Thomas speaks truth," Alaric said, his voice carefully neutral. "I have done terrible things. Villages have burned in my wake." He paused, studying the blacksmith's weathered face. "But never without cause. What cause justifies slaughter?" Thomas demanded. Alaric pulled a scroll from his pack, one of several ancient scrolls that Elric recognized from his teaching days. The vampire unrolled it carefully, revealing a map marked with dark stains. "Each mark represents a feeding," Alaric said matter-of-factly. "Lord Brennan of Ashford sold children to slavers. Sir Marcus Vale tortured peasants for sport. The merchant Prince Godfrey poisoned wells to force farmers off their land." Elric studied the map with growing amazement. "You've been targeting the corrupt." "Justice requires precision," Alaric replied. "The innocent have nothing to fear from me." Thomas frowned. That's not what the stories say. The stories are told by those with reason to fear justice. Alaric rolled up the map carefully. Though, I admit, the hunger sometimes makes precision difficult. An awkward silence fell over the group. Elric could see the refugees struggling to reconcile the monster of legend with this pale, articulate man who spoke of justice and carried ancient texts. "You still study," Elric observed, noting the scholarship implied in Alaric's records. Knowledge was the only thing that survived the transformation intact. Alaric's expression softened slightly. "You taught me that understanding one's enemy was the first step to victory. I have spent decades understanding myself." Little Mira toddled over, apparently unafraid of the vampire who towered above her. She tugged at Alaric's dark cloak until he knelt down to her level. "Hungry?" she asked, offering him a crust of bread from her small portion. The simple gesture sent visible shock through Alaric. His hands trembled as he gently declined the food. "Thank you, little one, but I eat different things." "What things?" Mira asked, with the boundless curiosity of childhood. Alaric looked helplessly at Elric, who stepped forward smoothly. "Some people need different food," Elric explained, "like how some animals eat meat and others eat grass." Mira nodded solemnly, apparently satisfied with this explanation. She patted Alaric's hand with her tiny fingers. "Okay, but share if get hungry." The vampire watched her return to her mother with an expression of such raw vulnerability that Elric felt his heart ache. Here was the student he remembered, the boy who had wept over injured animals and given his lunch to hungrier classmates. "She doesn't fear you," Elric observed. "Children haven't learned to hate yet," Alaric replied. "They see what is, not what they're told to see." A sudden crack echoed through the way station as one of the roof beams groaned under the weight of accumulated snow. Everyone looked up nervously as dust rained down from the rafters. "We need to clear the roof," Thomas said, "before it collapses." "In this storm?" Sarah asked, clutching Mira protectively. "It would be suicide." Alaric stood abruptly. "Not for me." Without waiting for permission, he moved to the door. "Wait," Elric called. "The cold, the wind, won't kill something already dead," Alaric finished. He paused at the threshold. "Though I should warn you, leaving this shelter may awaken other hungers. The storm carries scents, sounds." "We understand," Elric said firmly. "Do what you must." The vampire nodded and vanished into the howling blizzard. For nearly an hour, they heard nothing but the storm's fury. Then came sounds from above, scraping, shifting, the thud of snow hitting the ground outside. When Alaric finally returned, ice crystals covered his cloak and his pale skin bore an almost translucent quality. But the roof no longer groaned under its burden. "Thank you," Martha said simply. Alaric nodded, but Elric could see the effort it took him to remain still. The vampire's nostrils flared slightly, and his eyes held a restless hunger that hadn't been there before. "Perhaps you should hunt," Elric suggested quietly. "We'll be safe enough here for a few hours." "Hunt what?" Alaric asked, his voice strained. "These mountains are empty of game. The war has driven everything away." As if, in answer to his words, a long howl echoed through the storm, distant but unmistakably predatory. Then another, closer. Soon the night rang with the calls of a hunting pack. "Mountain wolves," Thomas breathed, "driven down by the storm." The refugees pressed closer together, suddenly aware of how fragile their shelter truly was. Wooden shutters and a single door would not stop determined predators. Another howl, much closer now. Then the soft thud of heavy bodies moving through snow, circling the way station. "They smell us," Sarah whispered, holding Mira tight. Alaric moved to the shuttered window, his supernatural senses reading the night like an open book. 7 of them. Large. Hungry. The first wolf appeared in the firelight. Leaking through the shutter cracks a massive grey shape with yellow eyes and bared fangs. It tested the door with its snout, then raised its head in a calling howl. "They're intelligent," Alaric observed with something like admiration. "Pack hunters. They know we're trapped." The wolves began throwing themselves against the door in coordinated attacks. The heavy wood held, but each impact sent shudders through the frame. "How long will it hold?" Elric asked. "Not long enough," Alaric replied. Then he smiled, and for a moment his fangs gleamed in the firelight. "But perhaps that's exactly what we need." He moved toward the door with fluid, predatory grace, and Elric suddenly understood. The vampire was no longer struggling against his nature, he was embracing it, but directing it toward protection rather than destruction. "Stay back," Alaric commanded, his voice carrying an authority that made even Thomas step away. "And whatever you hear, don't open this door until I return." The battle for survival was about to begin in earnest. The silence that followed Alaric's departure into the storm was more terrifying than any sound could have been. The refugees huddled around the dying fire, listening to the wind howl through the peaks and the occasional thud of wolf bodies against the way station's outer walls. Thomas had barricaded the door with benches and rope, but everyone knew it would only delay the inevitable if the pack decided to coordinate their attack. "How long do you think he'll be?" Sarah whispered, rocking Mira gently. Elric strained to hear anything beyond the storm's fury. "Not long. He knows we're vulnerable." A sudden crash from the roof made everyone jump. Then came sounds that defied description, snarls that belonged to no earthly creature, yelps of pain and terror, and underneath it all, something that might have been laughter. "Dear gods," Martha breathed. "What's he doing out there?" Young Henrik pressed his ear to the door. "I don't hear the wolves anymore." The silence stretched for nearly 20 minutes before a gentle knock came at the door, 3 soft raps that somehow conveyed both politeness and terrible power. "It's safe now," Alaric's voice called through the wood. Thomas hesitated, then began removing the barricades. When the door finally opened, Alaric stood in the threshold like a vision from a winter nightmare. His clothes were torn and stained with dark patches that steamed in the cold air. Ice crystals covered his hair and eyebrows, but his skin held a warmth it hadn't possessed before. In his arms, he carried the carcass of the largest wolf, easily 200 pounds of prime meat. "Dinner," he announced simply, setting the body down with careful grace. The refugees stared in stunned silence. The wolf had been killed cleanly, its throat opened by what appeared to be surgical precision. No signs of the savage mauling they had expected from a vampire's hunt. "The others?" Thomas asked. "Gone. The pack leader was all that mattered." Alaric wiped his hands on a cloth, his movements almost fastidious. Wolves respect strength above all else. Once their alpha fell, the rest scattered. Little Mira escaped her mother's grip and toddled over to examine the wolf with fearless curiosity. She patted its grey fur with her small hands, then looked up at Alaric with obvious approval. "Good puppy," she declared solemnly. Alaric's laugh was genuine, the first truly human sound he had made since revealing his identity. "Yes, little one. Good puppy." Thomas, ever practical, was already examining the carcass with a butcher's eye. "This will feed us for a week if we preserve it properly. We can smoke the meat, use the fat for fuel." He looked up at Alaric with grudging respect. "You've solved our survival problem." "For now," Alaric agreed. He pulled something from his pack, a small carved wooden horse, nearly identical to the one Mira always carried. "I made this while hunting. Thought she might like a companion for her friend." The craftsmanship was exquisite, far beyond what any vampire should have been capable of creating during a brief hunt in a blizzard. The wood was polished smooth, the proportions perfect, every detail rendered with loving care. Mira squealed with delight when Alaric knelt and offered her the gift. She clutched both horses to her chest, then impulsively threw her arms around the vampire's neck in a fierce hug. The effect on Alaric was immediate and profound. His entire body went rigid with shock, then slowly relaxed as if something frozen inside him was beginning to thaw. When Mira released him and ran back to her mother with her new treasure, tears tracked down his pale cheeks. "How did you carve that so quickly?" Elric asked softly. "Time moves differently when you're not entirely human," Alaric replied. "But the skill." He flexed his fingers, studying them as if seeing them for the first time. "I carved toys for Lyanna when we were children. I thought I had forgotten." Martha approached with her herb pouch, her healer's instincts overriding her fear. "You're injured," she observed, noting the tears in his clothing. "Wolves have sharp teeth," Alaric said dismissively. "It will heal. Let me see, anyway." To everyone's surprise, Alaric complied, allowing Martha to examine the wounds along his arms and chest. Her experienced hands found gashes that should have been bleeding freely, but were already beginning to close. "Remarkable," she murmured. "Your body heals like something unnatural," Alaric finished. "Because that's what I am." "No," Martha said firmly. "Like something designed to survive. There's a difference." As the refugees began the work of butchering and preserving the wolf meat, Elric found himself studying his former student with growing fascination. The brutally efficient killer who had stalked through legends was revealing himself to be something far more complex. "You could have drained the wolves," Elric observed. "Fed on their blood." "I could have," Alaric agreed, "but that would have tainted the meat, made it inedible for humans." He paused, then added quietly, "Besides, blood taken in violence tastes of fear and pain. I've had enough of that. Then what do you feed on now?" Alaric was quiet for a long moment, watching Mira play with her wooden horses by the fire. "There are deer in these mountains, though the wolves drove most away. Small game when I can find it. I've learned to take only what I need, and only from creatures that won't suffer. That must require enormous self-control." "It does. Every moment is a choice between what I am and what I was." Alaric's voice dropped to a whisper. "Some days the hunger wins, but not today." The work of preparing their unexpected feast continued through the afternoon. Thomas proved remarkably skilled at field dressing the carcass, while Martha supervised the smoking process with herbs she had managed to preserve. The way station filled with the rich scent of cooking meat, the first proper meal any of them had anticipated since the storm began. As evening approached, the refugees gathered around the fire to share their bounty. For the first time since they had fled their village, there was something approaching contentment in the small shelter. Alaric sat somewhat apart from the group, maintaining the distance of an apex predator among prey animals. But when Mira insisted on bringing him a small portion of cooked meat, he accepted it with grave courtesy. "I don't need this," he told her gently. "Share." Mira insisted, using the word she had learned from her mother. "Family shares." The word family hit Alaric like a physical blow. He stared down at the little girl with an expression of such raw longing that Elric felt his own heart break a little. "Yes," Alaric said softly. "Family shares." He didn't eat the meat, couldn't, by his nature, but he held it carefully in his hands, like a precious gift. And for the remainder of the evening, he remained close to the fire, close to the warmth of human companionship he had thought forever lost. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on the mountains. But inside the way station, something even more powerful was taking root. The fragile beginning of trust between a monster and the people who were slowly learning to see the man he used to be. The third morning brought an unexpected discovery that would change everything. Elric had risen before dawn to tend the smoking meat when he noticed Alaric's pack lying open beside his sleeping area. The vampire himself had vanished hunting, Elric assumed, or simply seeking the solitude that seemed necessary for his kind. but something metallic caught the firelight from within the pack's depths. Curiosity overcoming propriety, Elric approached for a closer look. What he saw made his blood freeze. A ceremonial dagger lay nestled among Alaric's belongings, its blade gleaming with an oily black sheen that seemed to absorb light. The handle was carved from what appeared to be bone, inscribed with runes that hurt to look at directly. Even from several feet away, Elric could feel the malevolent energy radiating from the weapon like heat from a forge. "You shouldn't touch that," Alaric's voice came from directly behind him. Elric spun around, heart hammering. The vampire stood in the doorway, snow melting from his cloak, his expression unreadable. "I wasn't going to," Elric said quickly, "but what is it?" Alaric moved to his pack with fluid grace, carefully, wrapping the dagger in dark cloth before returning it to its place. The instrument of my transformation, the blade that carved away my humanity and replaced it with this. "You've kept it all these years?" "A reminder," Alaric said simply, "of the price of desperation." Elric sat down on a nearby bench, his scholar's mind racing with questions. "Tell me what happened. The real story, not the legend." For a long moment, Alaric was silent, his crimson eyes fixed on the dying fire. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of self-recrimination. "They came on the feast of St. Michael," he began. "Armed men in unmarked armor, moving with military precision. Not bandits, despite what the official reports claimed. Someone had paid them well to eliminate my entire family line." Martha and Thomas had awakened, drawn by the quiet conversation. They listened from their bedrolls, pretending sleep but hanging on every word. My father was a minor lord, but he had been asking uncomfortable questions about the king's war taxes, about where the gold was really going, why villages were starving while the royal coffers overflowed. Alaric's hands clenched into fists. He had discovered something, evidence of massive corruption at the highest levels of government. Elric felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "That's why they targeted your family specifically. Complete elimination, no heirs, no questions, no investigations." Alaric's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "They killed the servants, first people who had served our house for generations, who had raised me from childhood. Then my parents slowly, while they forced Lyanna and me to watch. The refugees were no longer pretending to sleep. Sarah held Mira closer, while Henrik made quiet prayers under his breath. They saved us for last," Alaric continued, his control beginning to fray at the edges. "The interrogation lasted hours. They wanted to know what my father had discovered, where he had hidden his evidence. When we couldn't tell them because we truly didn't know, they began with Lyanna." Elric reached out instinctively, placing a gentle hand on his former student's shoulder. The flesh beneath his fingers was cold as winter stone, but trembling with suppressed emotion. "They were artists of pain," Alaric said bitterly. "They knew exactly how to inflict maximum suffering without causing death too quickly. And all the while they forced me to watch, bound and helpless, while my sister begged me to save her. Alaric, she looked at me with such trust," the vampire said, tears streaming freely now. "Even as they broke her, she believed her older brother would find a way, would be strong enough, clever enough, brave enough to rescue her. But I was just a boy who read books and carved wooden toys. What could I do against trained killers?" Thomas sat up fully, his blacksmith's pragmatism warring with unexpected sympathy. "You were children. No one could have expected—" "I prayed," Alaric interrupted. "As she died in agony, I prayed to every god I could name for the power to save her. When the recognized deities remained silent, I called out to darker powers, to anything that would listen, anything that would give me the strength for vengeance." He pulled the wrapped dagger from his pack again, unwrapping it with reverent care. The blade seemed to drink in the firelight, its surface reflecting nothing. "Something answered," he whispered. a voice that spoke of blood and power, of justice purchased with one's humanity. It offered me the strength to kill her murderers, to track down whoever had ordered their deaths, to become the instrument of divine vengeance. "And you accepted," Elric said gently, "without hesitation. The bargain was simple, my mortal soul, in exchange for the power to right the cosmic wrong that had been done to my family. The ritual was—" He shuddered. "The blade had to taste innocent blood first, my own blood, freely given to seal the compact." Elric stared at the dagger with new understanding. "This blade took your life, and gave me this existence. I rose 3 days later as something else entirely stronger, faster, nearly immortal. But the hunger came with it, and the rage. The thing that had answered my prayers had not mentioned those particular side effects." Martha rose quietly and approached them, her healer's instincts overriding her fear. "What happened to the men who killed your family?" Alaric's smile was terrible to behold. "I found them, one by one. The transformation had given me enhanced senses. I could track them by scent alone across half the kingdom. They died slowly, as Lyanna had died. But their pain brought me no peace, only a deeper hunger for more blood." "And whoever ordered their deaths?" Thomas asked. "Lord Chancellor Aldwyn," Alaric said simply. "The king's right hand. He had discovered my father's investigation into the missing tax revenues and decided to eliminate the threat permanently. He died in his bed 7 years later, though the official cause was listed as natural causes." Elric absorbed this revelation with growing horror. "You've been waging a war against corruption for 38 years. At first it was pure vengeance, but as the decades passed, I began to understand that Lyanna's death was just one symptom of a much larger disease. The kingdom is rotting from within, nobles who prey on the innocent, merchants who profit from suffering, officials who sell justice to the highest bidder." He carefully rewrapped the dagger and returned it to his pack. "The hunger makes it easy to justify. Each corrupt soul I take feeds the darkness while serving what I convince myself is justice. But the line between righteous vengeance and simple butchery grows thinner every year." Little Mira stirred in her mother's arms, awakening to the sound of quiet voices. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, and looked around the circle of somber faces. "Why everyone's sad?" she asked in her piping voice. Alaric looked at her with an expression of infinite sorrow. "Because sometimes, little one, the cost of doing what seems right is too high to bear." But Mira, with the wisdom that sometimes comes only to children, simply climbed down from her mother's lap and toddled over to Alaric. She climbed into his lap with complete trust and curled up against his chest. "Not sad now," she announced firmly. "Family no sad." And for a moment, holding this innocent child who saw only the man he might have been, Alaric allowed himself to imagine what redemption might feel like. The 4th day brought another revelation that shattered what the refugees thought they knew about their supernatural protector. Thomas had been examining Alaric's belongings while the vampire hunted for fresh game when he discovered a leather portfolio hidden beneath spare clothing. Curiosity, overcoming caution, he opened it to find detailed maps, documents, and what appeared to be a systematic record of deaths spanning decades. "Master Elric," he called quietly, his voice tight with concern. "You need to see this." The portfolio contained dozens of sheets covered in Alaric's careful script names, dates, locations, and brief descriptions of crimes. But as Elric studied the documents, a pattern emerged that defied every story they had heard about the Alpha Vampire. "Look at the victims," Elric said softly, his finger tracing down a list of names. "Lord Brennan sold children to slavers. Sir Marcus Vale tortured peasants for sport. Count Aldwyn embezzled relief funds during the famine of 32. Martha peered over his shoulder. "These aren't random killings." "No," Elric agreed. "They're executions." The map at the portfolio center was marked with blood-red ink, each location corresponding to a name on the lists. But rather than showing the chaotic rampage of a monster, the markings revealed careful planning, meticulous research, and what could only be described as a methodical campaign of justice. 73 deaths, Thomas counted. Over 38 years. He looked up from the papers with grudging respect. That's restraint for something supposedly driven by bloodlust. More than restraint, Elric said, studying a detailed report on a corrupt merchant. This level of investigation would rival any royal inquisitor. He's been documenting evidence, verifying crimes, ensuring he targets only the guilty. Sarah approached, carrying Mira, drawn by their quiet conversation. What does this mean? Before Elric could answer, Alaric's voice came from the doorway. It means I've retained more humanity than I thought possible. The vampire entered, carrying a pair of mountain hares, his hunting obviously successful, but his expression held none of the shame or rage they had come to expect when his nature was discussed. You've been maintaining justice records, Elric said. Not quite a question. Alaric set down his catch and approached the group with deliberate calm. The hunger makes it easy to justify killing, he said simply. But I discovered early that feeding on the innocent brings no satisfaction, only deeper corruption. Guilt, it seems, affects the taste of blood. Thomas held up one of the documents. This investigation into Lord Pemberton's grain hoarding you spent 3 months documenting his crimes before acting. 3 months, 2 weeks and 4 days, Alaric corrected. I wanted absolute certainty. When noble blood is spilled, questions are asked. Better to ensure the questions lead to exposure of their crimes rather than sympathy for their deaths. Martha studied the map with her healer's practiced eye for detail. You've avoided entire regions. The northern provinces, the coastal baronies, why? Clean governance, Alaric replied without hesitation. Lords who actually serve their people, merchants who deal fairly, officials who enforce justice rather than sell it. Evil exists everywhere, but it's not universal. How do you decide? Sarah asked, adjusting her hold on Mira. How can you be certain someone deserves to die? The question hung in the air like incense in a cathedral, heavy with moral weight. Alaric moved to the fire and knelt beside it, staring into the flames as if seeking answers in their dance. The same way any judge decides, he said finally. Evidence, testimony, witnesses. The difference is that my court has only one sentence and no appeals. That's terrifying power for one person to wield, Thomas observed. Yes, Alaric agreed, which is why I've developed rules. He pulled another document from the portfolio, a single sheet covered in his careful handwriting. My code, if you will. Elric accepted the document and read aloud for the group's benefit. First, absolute certainty of guilt. Second, crimes must cause genuine suffering to innocents. Third, no action, without multiple corroborating witnesses. Fourth, preference for natural deaths over obvious murder. Fifth, no children, regardless of their crimes. You spare children? Sarah asked, hope creeping into her voice. Always. Children can change, can be redeemed. Adults who prey on the innocent have made their choice. Alaric's expression softened as he looked at little Mira. Besides, I've seen what it does to a child to watch their family die. I wouldn't inflict that pain on anyone. Henrik spoke up from his corner, where he had been listening quietly. My village had a lord like the ones you describe. Baron Grimwald. He taxed us into starvation, then seized our children as payment, sold them to labor camps in the southern mines. Baron Grimwald died 2 years ago, Alaric said quietly. Hunting accident, according to the official reports. A crossbow bolt through the heart while alone in the forest. The old farmer's eyes widened. That was you. That was justice, Alaric corrected. Though I admit, the distinction grows harder to maintain with each passing year. Young Mira had been playing quietly with her wooden horses during the adult conversation, but now she looked up at Alaric with serious eyes. You help people? I try to, little one, but I'm not sure I'm helping anyone anymore. Help me, Mira announced firmly, climbing into his lap. Help, Mama. Help everyone here. The simple declaration seemed to hit Alaric like a physical blow. His arms tightened around the child instinctively, and when he looked up at the assembled refugees, his expression held a vulnerability they had never seen before. What if I've become the very thing I set out to destroy? He asked quietly. What if decades of dealing death have turned me into just another predator, justifying his hunger with pretty words about justice? Then you wouldn't ask that question, Elric said firmly. Monsters don't doubt themselves. They don't keep records or follow codes or spare. Children. They don't carve toys for little girls or hunt wolves to feed refugees. Martha nodded agreement. A true monster would have drained us all the first night. You've had a dozen opportunities to feed, and instead you've protected us. Protected you from everything except myself, Alaric said bitterly. No, Sarah said with quiet conviction. You've protected us from yourself too. Every time you choose restraint over hunger, compassion over cruelty, you're protecting us from the monster you could become. Thomas, ever practical, gestured toward the portfolio. These records show a pattern of justice, not random slaughter. Imperfect justice, perhaps, but justice nonetheless. The kingdom is better for having fewer predators in positions of power. But at what cost? Alaric asked. How many more innocent people have died because I chose to become judge and executioner rather than finding another way? How many more would have died if you had done nothing? Elric countered. Every corrupt lord you removed was someone who wouldn't prey on the innocent again. Every stolen future you avenged was a life that mattered. Alaric was quiet for a long moment, holding Mira as she dozed against his chest. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible above the storm's continued howling. I want to believe that, he whispered. I want to believe that Lyanna would recognize the justice in what I've become, rather than the monster. She would see what we see, Elric said gently. A man who has never stopped caring about the innocent, even when it meant carrying an unbearable burden of pain. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, but inside the way station, something fundamental had shifted. The refugees no longer saw Alaric as a monster they had to tolerate, but as a protector who had sacrificed his own peace to guard theirs. It was a fragile trust, built on shared revelations and small kindnesses. But in that moment, it felt strong enough to bridge the gap between human and vampire, between fear and understanding, between damnation and the first tentative hope of redemption. The fifth morning brought the sound of horses and the glint of steel through the storm. Alaric was the first to sense them, his supernatural hearing picking up the jingle of harness and the crunch of hooves in snow long before human ears could detect anything. He moved to the shuttered window with predatory silence, his entire demeanor shifting to high alert. How many? Elric asked, recognizing the vampire's sudden tension. 20 riders, possibly more, armed and disciplined. Alaric's voice carried a deadly calm. They're not refugees. Thomas reached for his makeshift weapons, while Martha gathered the children close. Bandits? Worse. Soldiers. Alaric stepped back from the window, his expression grim. They're searching for something. Or someone. The sound of horses grew louder, accompanied by the shouts of men calling to each other. Through the wind, then came the unmistakable thump of boots against the way station's door. Open, in the name of King Aldrich. A voice commanded. By royal decree, this shelter is to be searched. The refugees exchanged terrified glances. Royal soldiers in these mountains could only mean one thing: someone in their group was wanted by the crown. What do we do? Sarah whispered, clutching Mira protectively. Before anyone could answer, the door burst open with a crash of splintering wood. Armored figures poured into the way station, their swords drawn and ready. At their head strode a captain whose scarred face spoke of years of brutal campaigns. "Everyone against the wall," he barked. "Hands visible. Any sudden movements will be considered hostile." The refugees scrambled to comply, pressing themselves against the stone walls, while soldiers surrounded them with professional efficiency. But the captain's eyes were scanning the group with particular intent, as if searching for a specific face. When his gaze fell upon Elric, he smiled with cold satisfaction. "Elric the Heretic," he announced formally. "Also known as Elric the Corrupter, teacher of sedition and enemy of the realm. You are under arrest by order of His Majesty, King Aldrich." Elric felt the blood drain from his face. "On what charges?" The captain pulled a rolled parchment from his belt, an official decree bearing the king's seal. "Treason, sedition, corruption of noble youth, and conspiracy against the crown. Your sentence is death, to be carried out immediately upon capture." "Wait," Thomas protested, stepping forward. "He's just a teacher." "Silence." The captain's sword point appeared at Thomas's throat. "This man is a wanted traitor who has been evading royal justice for 5 years. His teachings have spawned rebellion and discord throughout the kingdom." Martha found her voice despite her terror. "What rebellion? What discord?" "The Children of Truth," the captain spat. "A seditious organization that seeks to overthrow the natural order. They quote his forbidden texts, spread his corrupt philosophy, and recruit others to their treasonous cause." Elric stared in shock. "I know nothing of any organization. I've lived in exile, helping refugees who just happen to include known rebels and dissidents." The captain gestured to his men. "Surround the rest. We'll interrogate them one by one." As the soldiers moved to comply, several of the refugees began pulling items from their packs, not personal belongings, but weapons and documents that spoke of far more than simple displacement. Henrik the farmer drew a sword with practiced ease, his aged hands steady on the hilt. "For the Children of Truth!" he shouted. Martha threw back her cloak to reveal leather armor beneath, while Sarah handed little Mira to another refugee and drew twin daggers from concealed sheaths. Even quiet Thomas produced a crossbow from his pack, its bolt already, nocked and ready. "Master Elric," Henrik said formally, "we are honored to serve the true cause of justice." The revelation hit Elric like a physical blow. These weren't random refugees he had gathered, they were members of an underground resistance, deliberately placed to ensure his protection during the journey. "You've been using me," he breathed. "We've been protecting you," Sarah corrected, her daggers gleaming in the firelight. "Your teachings gave birth to our movement. Your philosophy of justice and equality has spread throughout the kingdom, inspiring others to resist tyranny." The captain laughed harshly. "How touching." The blind prophet finally sees his flock. He raised his sword toward Elric. "Kill them all." The teacher dies slowly. But as the soldiers advanced, a voice spoke from the shadows near the door, soft, cultured, and utterly without fear. "I'm afraid I can't allow that." Every head turned toward Alaric, who had somehow moved to block the exit without anyone noticing. The vampire stood with casual grace, but his crimson eyes held a promise of violence that made even the hardened soldiers hesitate. "Another refugee," the captain sneered, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Not exactly," Alaric replied. Then he smiled, revealing fangs that gleamed like ivory knives. "Perhaps you've heard the stories. The Alpha Vampire, the bloodless, the monster that haunts the nightmares of corrupt nobles." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Several soldiers stepped backward instinctively, their hands trembling on their weapons. "Impossible," the captain breathed. "You're a myth, a story told to frighten children." "Ask Lord Brennan if I'm a myth," Alaric suggested pleasantly. "Oh, wait, you can't. He died 3 years ago when his throat was opened by something with very sharp teeth." He tilted his head thoughtfully. "Though I suppose you could ask his widow. She seemed quite relieved to be free of a husband who sold children to slavers." The captain's face had gone pale, but he held his ground. Even if you are what you claim, you're outnumbered 20-1. Am I? Alaric asked. Let me clarify the situation for you, Captain. You have entered my territory, threatened people under my protection, and drawn weapons against my... He paused, glancing at little Mira, who was watching the proceedings with wide eyes. Against my family. The word family carried such weight of possession and protection that several soldiers actually took another step backward. Your move, Captain, Alaric continued conversationally. Though I should warn you I haven't fed properly in days, and there's something particularly satisfying about the blood of those who prey upon innocents. The standoff stretched for an eternal moment, predator and prey sizing each other up across a room suddenly charged with supernatural menace. The captain's sword wavered slightly as he tried to decide whether the legends were true. Then Mira's voice cut through the tension like a bell. Alaric, protect family, she announced with complete confidence. Bad men, go away now. The simple declaration from a child who feared nothing seemed to tip some cosmic balance. The captain looked into Alaric's eyes and saw his own death waiting there with infinite patience. Withdraw, he commanded his men, his voice cracking slightly. We'll report that the heretic wasn't here. Wise choice, Alaric murmured. Though I'm curious who told you where to find Master Elric. The captain's hesitation lasted only a moment before survival instinct overcame loyalty. Lord Pemberton. He's been tracking the heretic's movements for months, waiting for the right moment to strike. Elric felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Pemberton, the grain merchant whose hoarding you documented. I never acted against him, Alaric said quietly, his eyes still fixed on the captain. His crimes were economic, not violent. I thought him worthy of mercy. Apparently, he disagreed with your assessment of mercy, the captain said, backing toward the door. He paid very well for information about the heretic's whereabouts. As the soldiers filed out into the storm, the captain paused at the threshold. This isn't over, Vampire. The king has other resources, other hunters. Let them come, Alaric replied with deadly calm. I've grown quite fond of this particular family. Threats against them will be answered with extreme prejudice. When the last soldier had vanished into the swirling snow, silence fell over the way station like a burial shroud. The refugees revealed now as rebels slowly lowered their weapons, while Elric struggled to process the magnitude of what he had learned. How long, he asked Sarah, how long have you been following me? Since your exile began, she admitted. Your students formed the children of truth within months of your departure. Your teachings about justice and equality spread like wildfire among those who suffered under the current system. Henrik sheathed his sword with practiced ease. We've been protecting you while you protected others. Every refugee camp you've guided to safety, every person you've helped, they remember. They spread the word. They join the cause. What cause? Elric demanded. I never preached revolution. You preached something more dangerous, Martha said gently. Hope. The idea that people deserve better than tyranny. That justice should serve the innocent rather than the powerful. She gestured toward Alaric. Is it so surprising that others would take action when mere words failed? Alaric moved to stand beside Elric, his supernatural senses still alert for returning soldiers. It seems we have more in common than either of us realized, Master. We've both been waging war against corruption, just through different methods. I never wanted this, Elric said helplessly. I just wanted to teach, and your teaching created something beautiful, Sarah said firmly. A movement dedicated to the very principles you instilled in your students. Justice for all, protection for the innocent, hope for a better future. Little Mira tugged at Alaric's cloak until he knelt down to her level. Family safe? She asked. For now, little one, but we may need to leave soon. Mira nodded solemnly, then threw her arms around his neck in a fierce hug. Alaric, keep family safe. Always. As the vampire held the trusting child, Elric saw something extraordinary in his former student's expression, not the hunger of a predator or the rage of the damned, but the fierce protectiveness of a man who had found something worth preserving. The storm was far from over, and now they faced enemies far more dangerous than weather or wolves. But in that moment, teacher and student stood united in their commitment to protecting the innocent, and perhaps in that unity lay the seeds of redemption for them, both. The discovery beneath the way station came purely by accident. Martha had been searching for additional firewood in the storage area behind the main chamber when her foot caught on a loose stone. As she stumbled, her hand pressed against what appeared to be a solid wall, only to have it give way, revealing a hidden passage that descended into darkness. "Master Elric," she called softly, her voice tight with excitement. "You need to see this." The group gathered around the concealed entrance, peering into depths that seemed to swallow their torchlight. Ancient stone steps led downward, carved with symbols that predated the kingdom by centuries. "Pre-conquest architecture," Elric murmured, his scholar's eye recognizing the craftsmanship. "This way station was built on something much older." Alaric moved to the entrance, his supernatural senses probing the darkness below. "There's a chamber down there, large, and something else." He paused, nostrils flaring. "Power, old, magic, carefully contained. Dangerous?" Thomas asked, hefting his crossbow. "Not dangerous," Alaric replied slowly. "Purposeful. Whatever lies below was created with specific intent." The descent took nearly 10 minutes, the narrow stairs winding deeper into the mountain's heart than seemed possible. When they finally emerged into the hidden chamber, everyone gasped in wonder. The space was enormous, a natural cavern that had been carefully shaped and carved by ancient hands. The walls were covered in intricate symbols that seemed to move in the flickering torchlight, while the floor bore a complex pattern of interlocking circles and geometric designs that hurt the eyes to follow too closely. At the chamber's center lay a ritual circle carved directly into the living stone, its surface inlaid with precious metals that gleamed despite their obvious age. Around the circle's perimeter, 12 stone pedestals held various artifacts, crystals, ceremonial blades, vessels of unknown purpose. "What is this place?" Sarah whispered, instinctively holding Mira closer. Elric moved slowly around the circle's edge, translating the ancient symbols with growing excitement. "It's a transformation chamber," he said, his voice filled with awe, "specifically designed for reversing dark magic rituals." Alaric froze at the chamber's entrance. "That's impossible." "The inscriptions are quite clear," Elric continued, his fingers tracing the carved symbols. "This was created by the Order of the Silver Dawn, an ancient brotherhood dedicated to combating supernatural corruption. They built places like this as sanctuaries, where those affected by dark magic could seek healing. You're saying this could—" Alaric couldn't finish the sentence, hope and terror warring in his expression. "Reverse vampirism. Yes, restore your mortality." Elric looked up from the symbols, his eyes bright with possibility. The ritual would be complex, dangerous, but theoretically possible. Henrik whistled low. "After all these centuries, such a place still exists, protected by the mountain itself," Martha observed, studying the chamber's construction with her healer's eye. "The way station above was built to conceal and guard this place." Alaric moved slowly into the chamber, but stopped well short of the ritual circle. What would such a process require? Elric continued his examination of the inscriptions, translating as he read, "A willing subject, obviously. Someone with knowledge of the original transformation details about the ritual that created the vampiric state." And he paused, his expression growing troubled. "What?" Sarah asked. "A blood sacrifice. Not death," Elric clarified quickly, "but a significant offering of life force. Someone would need to anchor the subject to humanity while the dark magic was purged." How significant? Thomas demanded. Potentially fatal, Elric admitted. The text warns that the anchor risks their own life in the process. Silence fell over the chamber like a funeral shroud. The implications were staggering. Alaric could potentially regain his humanity, but only at the cost of someone else's life. No, Alaric said firmly. I won't ask anyone to die for my redemption. What if the anchor survived? Mira asked in her piping voice. She had been listening to the adult conversation with the intense focus children sometimes displayed. What do you mean, little one? Elric knelt to her level. Mama says sharing makes things better. What if more people shared? Mira's innocent question carried surprising wisdom. Elric's eyes widened as understanding dawned. Multiple anchors. If the life force required could be distributed among several people, the individual risk would be much lower. Martha finished, her healer's training making the calculations. Dangerous still, but survivable. How many would be needed? Henrik asked. Elric studied the inscriptions more carefully, noting details he had missed in his initial excitement. The circle has 12 points of focus. Each would require an anchor, someone willing to share their life force for the transformation. We have 17 people, Sarah said quietly. More than enough volunteers. You don't understand the risk, Alaric protested. Dark magic doesn't surrender its hold easily. The backlash could kill everyone in the chamber. And staying as you are guarantees what? Thomas asked bluntly. A century of feeding on blood? Growing hunger? Increasing corruption? Alaric was silent for a long moment, staring at the ritual circle as if it might hold answers to questions he didn't dare voice. There's something else, he said finally. The soldiers will return with reinforcements. If we attempt this ritual and fail, we'll be trapped here when they arrive. If we don't attempt it, what changes? Henrik countered. The king wants Master Elric dead. We're all marked as rebels now. Our choices are transformation or death or flight, Martha suggested. We could escape through the mountains. To where? Sarah asked. How long before they track us down? How long before Lord Pemberton's gold buys information about our location? Little Mira toddled over to Alaric and tugged at his cloak until he knelt down. Scared? She asked solemnly. Terrified, Alaric admitted. Me too sometimes, but family helps. She pressed her wooden horse into his hands, the one he had carved for her. Share scared. Share brave too. The simple gesture seemed to unlock something in Alaric's expression. He looked around the chamber at the faces surrounding him, people who had seen him at his worst and somehow found reasons to trust him anyway. If we do this, he said slowly, there's no guarantee it will work. The magic involved is older than the kingdom, older than recorded history. One mistake could destroy us all. And if we don't? Elric asked gently. If you remain as you are, what happens when the Turiel, hunger grows too strong? What happens to the man I see emerging from the monster? Alaric closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they held a determination that hadn't been there before. We would need to prepare carefully. Study the inscriptions, understand every aspect of the ritual. Rush this, and we die. How long do we have? Thomas asked. The soldiers mentioned other hunters, Alaric replied. Professional vampire killers most likely. They'll need time to reach these mountains, but once they do, he shrugged eloquently. Days, not weeks, Henrik summarized. At most. Elric rose and moved to one of the stone pedestals, examining the artifacts placed there. These items are ritual components, he said. Sacred spring water, blessed silver, phoenix feather, everything needed for a purification ceremony. Convenient, Martha observed. Purposeful, Alaric corrected. This chamber was designed for exactly this purpose. The Order of the Silver Dawn knew that. Supernatural corruption would persist through the ages. They prepared for it. Sarah approached one of the pedestals and carefully lifted a vial of crystal-clear water that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Sacred spring water? From the wellspring of sorrows, Elric translated from nearby inscriptions, blessed by priests of 3 different faiths and charged with purification magic. Just holding it should burn a vampire's flesh. All eyes turned to Alaric, waiting to see his reaction. The vampire approached Sara slowly, his expression tense with anticipation. When his fingers brushed the vial, there was a moment of contact. Then he smiled with genuine wonder. "It's warm," he said softly. "Warm, not burning. It feels like coming home." "Then you're already closer to humanity than you believed," Elric said with quiet satisfaction. "The corruption hasn't claimed you completely." "What does this mean for the ritual?" Henrik asked. "It means we have a real chance." "Of success," Elric replied. "If his vampiric nature was absolute, the sacred water would cause agony. Instead, it recognizes something redeemable in him." Alaric set the vial carefully back on its pedestal, but his eyes remained fixed on it with an expression of desperate longing. "When?" he asked. "When do we attempt this?" "Tomorrow night," Elric decided. "That gives us time to study the ritual completely, prepare ourselves mentally, and ensure we understand every aspect of the process. And if the soldiers return before then..." Alaric's expression shifted back to the predatory calm they had come to recognize. "Then they'll discover why vampires are considered apex predators. But preferably, we complete the ritual and face whatever comes as a united family, human and redeemed." As the group began the careful process of examining each ritual component and translating every inscription, none of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows at the chamber's edge, a presence that had followed them down from the way station above, drawn by sense of power and possibilities. The true test of their bond and Alaric's humanity was about to begin. The ritual began at midnight, when the ancient texts claimed the barriers between life and death were thinnest. 12 volunteers arranged themselves around the stone circle's perimeter, each standing at one of the carved focal points. Elric had spent the day carefully positioning them according to the inscription's precise requirements, strongest anchors at the cardinal directions, with the more fragile refugees filling the intermediate positions. At the circle's center, Alaric knelt on the cold stone, the ceremonial transformation dagger laid before him. The same blade that had stolen his humanity 38 years ago would now serve as the focus for its return, a bitter irony that wasn't lost on anyone present. "Remember," Elric called out, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "When the ritual begins, you must maintain physical contact with your focal stone until completion. Breaking the connection could kill us all." Martha nodded from her position at the eastern point, her hands already pressed against the carved symbols. "How will we know when it's working?" "Trust me," Alaric said grimly. "You'll know." Elric lifted the vial of sacred spring water, the catalyst that would begin the transformation. In the torchlight, the crystal-clear liquid seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, eager to fulfill its ancient purpose. "Are you ready?" he asked his former student. Alaric closed his eyes, centering himself for what was to come. "I've been ready for 38 years. The first drops of sacred water touched the transformation dagger's blade, and the chamber erupted in supernatural fire. Light blazed from the ritual circle with the intensity of a captured star, while the carved symbols on the walls began to glow with eldritch energy. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that frost formed on the stone surfaces, and the air itself seemed to thicken with power. Alaric screamed. It wasn't the cry of physical pain, but something far deeper, the sound of a soul being torn between two natures. His body convulsed as the sacred water's purification magic clashed with decades of vampiric corruption, each force trying to claim absolute dominion. "Hold your positions," Elric shouted over the rising magical storm. "The connection must not be broken." Around the circle's perimeter, the human anchors gasped as they felt the ritual's pull on their life force. It started as a gentle tugging sensation, like blood flowing from a small cut, but quickly intensified to something far more demanding. Thomas gritted his teeth as power flowed from him into the circle. "How long does this last?" "The texts weren't specific," Elric replied, his own strength beginning to ebb. "But the transformation took years to complete originally. Reversing it, his words were cut off as Alaric's scream reached a new pitch of agony. The vampire's form began to blur and shift, caught between human and monster as the competing magics warred within him. His fangs elongated and retracted repeatedly, while his crimson eyes flickered between their supernatural glow and something approaching human brown. "Something's wrong," Sarah gasped, her face pale with the effort of maintaining her connection. "He's fighting it." "The vampiric nature doesn't want to surrender," Martha observed through clenched teeth. "It's been part of him too long." At the circle's center, Alaric was indeed fighting not the transformation, but 38 years of accumulated darkness that had wrapped itself around his soul like chains. Every corrupt soul he had consumed, every drop of blood taken in vengeance, every moment of embraced monstrosity rose up to defend its claim on him. Memories flooded through him in a torrent of pain and regret. Lyanna's face as she died, screaming his name, the first victim's terror as supernatural fangs pierced flesh. Decades of hunting corrupt nobles, telling himself it was justice while the hunger grew stronger with each feeding. "I don't deserve this," he gasped between convulsions. "I don't deserve redemption." "That's not your choice to make," Elric said firmly, his own body trembling with magical exhaustion. "Redemption isn't earned, it's given. Accept it." But the vampiric corruption had found its strongest defense in Alaric's own self-hatred. The transformation faltered as his will wavered, caught between the desire for humanity and the certainty that he had traveled too far down the dark path to return. Little Mira's voice cut through the magical chaos like a bell. "Alaric, look!" The child had somehow broken free from her mother's protective embrace and now stood at the circle's very edge, just beyond the barrier of purifying fire. In her tiny hands, she held both wooden horses, the old one that was hers, and the new one he had carved for her. "Family shares," she called out, her innocent voice carrying perfectly despite the supernatural storm raging around them. "Share good things, too." She threw both toys into the circle, where they landed at Alaric's feet. The simple act, a child's gift offered without thought of cost or worthiness, shattered the deadlock between competing magics. The vampiric corruption recoiled as if struck, unable to comprehend such pure, selfless love. In that moment of weakness, the sacred water's purification magic surged forward with renewed power. Alaric's body arched as the transformation reached its critical point. His fangs began to retract for the final time, his supernatural strength flowing away like water from a broken dam. The crimson glow in his eyes flickered and died, replaced by the warm brown of his original human heritage. But the ritual was far from complete. The magical energies continued to build toward a crescendo that would either restore his mortality completely or destroy everyone in the chamber. The chamber's ancient stones began to crack under the weight of magical forces never meant to be contained by mortal construction. Elric watched in growing alarm as the ritual circle's carved symbols flared beyond their intended brightness, the purification magic building toward a release that could shatter the mountain itself. Around the perimeter, several of the human anchors had collapsed to their knees, their life force nearly drained by the demanding transformation. "We're losing cohesion," Martha gasped, blood trickling from her nose as the magical strain pushed her body beyond its limits. At the circle's center, Alaric convulsed as the final barriers between his vampiric and human natures dissolved. But something was wrong. The transformation was consuming too much power, drawing more life force from the anchors than the ritual required. "The corruption is fighting back," Elric realized with growing horror. "It's trying to drain everyone here to maintain its hold." Thomas struggled to maintain his connection despite the agony coursing through his body. Can you stop it? Not without. Elric's words were cut off as he spotted movement in the chamber's darkest corner. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, pale, and moving with predatory grace that matched Alaric's own supernatural abilities. Another vampire, drawn by the sense of power and blood, had followed them into the sacred chamber. "How fascinating," the intruder purred, his voice carrying aristocratic disdain. "The mighty Alpha, attempting to abandon his gifts. How wonderfully pathetic." The newcomer's presence sent fresh waves of corruption through the chamber, his vampiric nature feeding power to Alaric's struggling darkness. The transformation faltered as competing influences tore at the fragile balance Elric had fought to achieve. "Victor," Alaric snarled through gritted teeth, recognizing his unexpected visitor. "What are you doing here?" "Ensuring you don't make a mistake we'll all regret," Victor replied smoothly. He was younger than Alaric in vampiric years, but older in cruelty, his eyes holding the cold malice of someone who had never struggled with conscience. "Do you think the others will simply allow you to become human again, to reveal our secrets to mortal authorities?" "The others?" Elric demanded. "The Council of Night," Victor explained, with obvious pleasure at their ignorance. "We've been watching your pathetic attempt at redemption with growing concern. Vampires don't retire, Alaric. We don't seek forgiveness. We are apex predators, and you will remember your place." With supernatural speed, Victor lunged toward the nearest human anchor, Henrik, whose position at the northern focal point made him a critical component of the ritual. Vampire claws extended toward the old farmer's throat, intent on breaking the circle and dooming the transformation. But Alaric, even weakened by the pulse, ongoing purification, moved faster. He threw himself between Victor and Henrik with desperate fury, his partially human body absorbing claws meant for an innocent throat. Pain exploded through his chest as supernatural talons found their mark, but he held his ground. "You want to stop this ritual?" Alaric gasped, his blood flowing freely onto the ancient stones. "You'll have to go through me." "Gladly," Victor sneered, pressing his attack with renewed vigor. The battle that followed was unlike anything the refugees had ever witnessed. Two supernatural beings clashed in the chamber's center, while magical energies swirled around them like a living storm. But this wasn't a fair fight. Alaric's strength was already depleted by the transformation, while Victor fought at full vampiric power. Elric watched his former student fall back under the relentless assault and made a desperate decision. Pulling a phoenix feather from the ritual components, he spoke a word of power that set the ancient artifact ablaze with purifying fire. "The feather!" he shouted, hurling the burning plume toward the struggling vampires. "Catch it!" Alaric's reflexes, still supernatural despite his ongoing transformation, snatched the phoenix feather from the air. The moment it touched his fingers, renewal magic flooded through his weakened form. Not enough to fully restore his vampiric strength, but sufficient to even the odds. The phoenix fire spread from the feather to engulf both combatants, but while Victor screamed in agony at the purifying flames, Alaric felt only warmth and strength returning to his limbs. "Impossible." Victor snarled, his perfect features marred by burns from the phoenix fire. "You're becoming human. This power should destroy you. I'm becoming something new," Alaric replied with sudden understanding. "Not quite human, not quite vampire, something in between." With this realization came clarity about the transformation's true purpose. The ritual wasn't meant to completely strip away his vampiric nature. It was designed to purify it, to remove the corruption while preserving the strength needed to protect innocence. Alaric's counterattack drove Victor backward, phoenix fire trailing from his hands like golden ribbons. Each blow carried not just physical force, but the power of redemption itself, burning away decades of accumulated darkness. "The anchors," Martha called out weakly. "We can't hold much longer." Around the circle's perimeter, the human volunteers were reaching their absolute limits. Sarah had collapsed completely, while Thomas swayed on his feet like a man fighting unconsciousness. Alaric looked at his failing family, then at Victor, who was preparing for another assault, and made his choice. "Elric," he called out, his voice carrying new authority, "complete the ritual. Now." "But Victor, we'll face a redeemed vampire," Alaric finished grimly, "and learn what true justice looks like. The transformation's final. The phase was about to begin. The transformation completed itself with a sound like breaking chains. Golden light erupted from the ritual circle as the last of Alaric's vampiric corruption burned away, leaving behind something unprecedented in the chamber's ancient history. When the radiance finally faded, a figure rose from the stone floor who was neither fully human nor completely vampire, but something entirely new. Alaric stood with fluid grace, his appearance subtly changed from what it had been. His pale skin now held a warm undertone that spoke of life rather than death, while his eyes, no longer crimson but not quite human brown, either held depths that seemed to reflect both starlight and flame. The fangs were gone, replaced by normal teeth, but an aura of controlled power surrounded him like a second skin. Victor stared in shock and growing fear. "What are you?" "Redeemed," Alaric replied simply. Then he moved. The battle that followed was swift and decisive. Victor's crude vampiric strength met something far more refined. Power guided by conscience, supernatural ability channeled through moral purpose. Each of Alaric's strikes carried the weight of justice rather than mere violence, burning away Victor's corruption while inflicting wounds that even vampiric healing couldn't instantly repair. Within moments, Victor lay broken against the chamber wall, his form already beginning to dissolve as the phoenix fire continued its purifying work. "Tell the council," Alaric said quietly, "that redemption is possible for any who truly seek it. But those who prey on innocence will find me a far more dangerous enemy than the monster I used to be." Victor's final scream echoed through the chamber before silence fell like a benediction. Around the ritual circle, the human anchors slowly regained their strength as the magical drains ceased. Elric helped Martha to her feet, while Thomas checked on the other volunteers with characteristic thoroughness. "Is everyone alive?" Sarah asked weakly, cradling Mira, who had somehow slept through the entire supernatural battle. "More than alive," Henrik observed with wonder. "Look at your hands." The old farmer was right. Each person who had served as an anchor now bore a subtle mark, a faint silver tracery along their palms that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The transformation ritual had changed them too, binding them together in ways that transcended normal human connection. "What does this mean?" Thomas asked, studying his marked palm with fascination. Elric examined the symbols with his scholar's eye, translating from half-remembered texts about the Order of the Silver Dawn. "You're connected now. Not just to each other, but to him." He gestured toward Alaric, who was carefully examining Victor's remains. "You share a bond that death itself couldn't break." "Family," Mira announced with satisfaction, though she was still drowsy from sleep. "Told you, family shares." Alaric returned to the group, his new nature evident in every movement. The predatory grace remained, but it was tempered now by something warmer, protectiveness rather than hunger, strength in service of love rather than vengeance. "What happens now?" Martha asked. "The soldiers will return, probably with reinforcements. The kingdom still wants Master Elric dead. Then the kingdom will have to go through all of us," Alaric said with quiet conviction, "but I suspect things are about to change more dramatically than anyone expects." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses echoed from above. But this time, the riders bore different banners, not the royal colors, but the silver and blue of the Children of Truth. The rescue party that emerged into the hidden chamber was led by a young woman whose bearing spoke of noble birth, but whose eyes held the fire of true conviction. She knelt immediately upon seeing Elric, her voice thick with emotion. "Master," she said, "formerly, We bring word from the capital. King Aldrich is dead, poisoned by his own food taster, who confessed to serving Lord Pemberton's corruption ring. Prince Marcus has assumed the throne and issued pardons for all political prisoners. The news hit the refugees like a physical blow. Freedom offered just when they had resigned themselves to perpetual exile. The Children of Truth are to be recognized as an official organization, the young woman continued. Your teachings are no longer forbidden but encouraged. The new king wishes to rebuild the kingdom on foundations of justice and equality. Elric stared in stunned silence. How is this possible? Your influence spread farther than you knew, she explained. Students in every province, teaching others, building networks of hope and resistance. When the moment came to act against the corruption, we were ready. Alaric approached the messenger with careful steps. And supernatural creatures? What is the new king's position on things that were once considered monsters? The young woman studied his transformed features with obvious curiosity, but no fear. Prince King Marcus believes that redemption should be offered to any who seek it genuinely. He has heard stories of the Alpha Vampire's campaign against corruption. If such a being chose to serve justice rather than hunger, he would be welcome. Alaric finished with growing wonder. 3 months later, the small village of Millbrook had been rebuilt into something far grander than it had ever been before. The new Academy of Justice stood at its center, where Elric taught philosophy and ethics to students from across the kingdom, while Alaric served as both protector and practical instructor in the complexities of supernatural law. Little Mira, now approaching her 7th birthday, attended classes with the intense focus she had always shown for important matters. Her wooden horses, both the original and Alaric's carved gift, sat on her desk as she practiced writing the words that would someday change the world. In the evenings, when lessons ended and students returned to their dormitories, teacher and former student would sit by the fire and discuss the day's challenges. Sometimes Martha would join them, sharing news from her expanded healing practice, or Thomas would stop by with problems from his new position as the village's master craftsman. "Do you ever regret it?" Elric asked one quiet evening as snow began to fall outside their warm sanctuary. The transformation? Alaric considered the question while watching Mira play with Sarah by the hearth. "How can I regret becoming what I was always meant to be?" "And what's that?" Alaric smiled, his transformed features radiating peace that had eluded him for 38 years. "A protector of innocence, a guardian of justice, a man who remembers that even monsters can find their way home, given enough love and second chances." Outside, snow continued to fall on a kingdom slowly, learning that redemption was possible for any soul brave enough to seek it. And in the warm glow of the Academy's firelight, a redeemed vampire and his beloved teacher planned lessons that would teach the next generation about the transformative power of hope, justice, and unconditional love. The monster had become a man again. But more importantly, the man had learned what it truly meant to be human.